Today is Dr. Bob Schuchts with the Theology of the Body Training and Healing Center. Dr. Bob, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Christina. Good to be with you.
I feel really honored and privileged to have you on because I feel like you have not yet been discovered. I feel like I went to some kind of talent contest and I saw you perform and said, oh my gosh, how come people don't know about this? Really, it is such a phenomenal gift and insight that I believe that you have, and it really goes back to my whole theory that God creates persons to come into being at the very time that we all need them the most. And so for whatever reason, you have been brought into my life, and God has put you in a beautiful and ideal spot to help bring healing to persons and families. And so I would like to begin with the show for you to talk a little bit about your own family. As you know, I kind of told you in an email that the show is about reestablishing the dignity of the human person, but particularly looking at the Holy Father's intentions for the month. And this month, of course, is dealing with helping to bring material and spiritual healing to those that are suffering with AIDS. And so I kind of am focusing on woundedness. But you have a particular story, don't you, about your own brother that was suffering and dealing with AIDS. Is that right?
Yes. My brother died about 15 years ago of AIDS, and the story leading up to his death and then following his death was just a beautiful, grace of healing for him and for the whole family.
Now, can you tell me a little bit? Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of family you had and how many brothers and sisters you have?
Dave was the oldest of 7 children, and we lived in Pittsburgh at the time when we were growing up, and my parents were very involved in the Catholic Church and the renewal movement. And then my brother Dave was a year and a half older than me, and we were really close friends and played sports together, did a lot of things together as children. And then after my parents divorced, kind of things grew apart for the family, and my brother Dave became heroin addict. And so from the time when he was 16, I was 14, until the time we were close to his death, we were separated. Much of that time we would see each other, but he was still frequently on and off heroin trips. Disappeared for a while. So it was a long period of separation during those years.
And you were telling us that I feel like I have a lot of inside scoop because I've gotten to be there for the classes and get to know you and hear your story a little bit. But for our listeners who don't have that kind of insight, can you share, there are reasons why people end up using sex, using food, using heroin, using substances or somatic relief, if you will, to numb their pain. Could you share with us a little bit of why you think maybe or do you think that sometimes there's a predisposition that some persons fall into this? I mean, why do you think that this is something that your brother decided to help him deal and cope with anxiety and difficulties of family life?
There's one thing, just a history of addiction in my father's side of the family, on the men's side, and my father also part of what led up to the divorce with my father's alcoholism. So I think there's some generational things and a mixture, how much of it is spiritual, how much of it is psychological, how much of it is physical, genetic. But nevertheless, there's some vulnerability there, I think. But with all addiction, I also believe that there are pain medication, as you mentioned. And, a lot of Dave's addiction started before the divorce. In fact, he and I together were partners in smoking cigarettes from young children. He started getting drugs late grade school, 7th, 8th grade, but nothing serious at all. He was 15 when he started to take heroin. I believe that when there's that kind of an intense addiction, there's a lot of pain underneath it. My understanding in retrospect of the pain that Dave was probably similar to the pain that a lot of us were in the family. But we all handled it in very different ways. I handled it through excelling at school and sports and those kind of things. Dave handled it in his own particular way, which was just to go off and find a way to relieve the pain and get high and escape from the world.
Well, there came a time where he became so ill that how did you all intervene in that last time and finally help bring healing to him?
Well, there's really a build-up to that, but I can remember a time when he was wanting to get free, and he said, "There's nothing else in my life that gives me this sense of euphoria and peace, and I don't want to give it up." But at that point, he had a daughter, and he had abandoned his daughter because of his drug habit. So I think his conscience was really beginning to bother him. But I think the key moment was when we decided not to bail him out of jail the second time he was in jail. And it was a very hard decision because he could have gotten out, but we decided that there needed to be some time where he could stop and reflect. And I had just gone through a spiritual renewal movement called Christ Renews Parish. And as he was in jail and getting out of jail, my wife Margie and my daughter Christina, who were young at the time, they were teenagers, invited him into our home. So he came with us just clean because of the jail, but not because of any recovery. And still very rough in different ways. But I guess he saw enough of the effect of the Holy Spirit in my life that he decided that he wanted to go through a renewal weekend himself 6 months later. And so on that renewal weekend, he was really struggling for the whole of the weekend until the middle of the night after he'd gone to the confession for the first time in 30 years. He had done a lot of really hurtful things to himself and to others, to his family during those years. When he went to confession to our pastor and confessed it all, rather than feel relief, what he felt was an awareness of how much he'd done. So he was just overwhelmed by self-hatred at that point. And he said he woke up at 3 that morning, just filled with self-hatred, and went out into the sanctuary before the tabernacle and was kind of shouting at God, "How could you forgive me? How could you forgive me? Look at all I've done." At this point, he didn't know he had AIDS. At this point, he just knew that he had gone through the addiction and completed all the pain. And in the middle of crying out to God, he sensed that small voice that said, "Hasn't your family forgiven and accepted you?" And he said, "Yes." And then came that something think that I want to do is great. So I am the one who's really forgiven you. Pastor, no words to express that to you. At that point, he broke and sobbed. I don't know how long. He just said the first time he cried in at least 20 to 30 years. And from that, we could see the beginning of change in him. But it was a process. It was a lot that we worked out. And it came to a head when he found out that he was going to get tested. He had symptoms of HIV and was going to get tested to see if he had AIDS. I can remember sitting out back of his house and said, "I'm at peace, whatever the decision is, whatever they find out, because they finally have a purpose in my life. And if I end up having AIDS, the purpose in my life is to be someone with AIDS who loves God and is a witness to Christ." And hearing him say that was so different than the man he'd been for 10, 20 years before that. And sure enough, as I'll share in a minute, his dying process was a beautiful witness of Christ and a beautiful healing to the members of our family.
I guess I'm really struck by the very thing that, I go out and tell parents all the time when I'm speaking of chastity, which is more is caught than taught. That sounds like that's what happened with you and your family, is that You didn't preach to him. You just loved him where he was at, and that mercy, that love, is what opened his heart to be receptive. That he was lovable. That he could be lovable. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. And even though I tried to preach to him for all those years before this, that didn't work. What worked was accepting and loving him. But even in that love, until after he had his experience with God, he saw it, he wanted it, he couldn't receive it. It was only when all that broke in his own heart could he receive it, he could believe it.
So it sounds like we have to have the courage to go into the wound a little bit if we want to find the redemption on the other side.
You sound like somebody with experience.
Oh, yes. I think, I come to this realization, I have to tell you, after being at your course. I spoke at a women's conference in Tennessee, and God showed me this picture of the wounds in Christ's hands, that are supposed they were put there by the nails, which symbolize our sin, that he died for our sin, and how Thomas put his fingers into those wounds to kind of show him. And I had this imagery that, that our wounds are actually so powerful once they're redeemed, that the enemy tries to put those hands, those wounded palms, right up to our own hands. So we're walking around with hands over our eyes because we're so blinded by our wounds. So the enemy is showing us the very thing he knows is the most dangerous to him and the most powerful gift for the church. Not because, it's because he wants us to be so afraid, so overwhelmed and overcome with, our own self-sabotaging behavior, our own guilt, all of the animosity, none of it which is mercy, because I think Mother Angelica said that you could take every last catastrophe, the biggest sin, all of the horrible atrocities and murders and everything, all of the Holocaust, and all of the sin that even hasn't been committed yet, and it is but a drop in the ocean of God's mercy. And I feel like once we realize the tricks of the enemy, which is to make us so fearful of that wound, once we realize that once we go into that wound, on the other side is like Thomas putting his hands into those glorified wounds. There's a shining light that wants to shine through that very broken place in us, and that is our greatest gift to the world.
There is a total upside down of condemnation. Amen.
Yeah. And I think it consoles. Yes.
Isaiah 61 says, I will give you double honor in the place of shame. That place where the places of our deepest shame, when God's grace comes through there in the world, it becomes more powerful than anything else in our life.
I found it becomes the best place to evangelize from, too. People can relate to your brokenness. I find when I am the most forthcoming about all the places I fall short, all the places where I'm broken, all the places where I have failed as a wife or a mother, that is the place where I feel like I'm the best able to share that I'm still yet loved in those places, and that every day is another day to give my yes, and that gives people hope. So it's kind of ironic that the very thing you think you need to hide because somebody would say, oh, well, that person isn't a good person to evangelize or to inspire, actually is the best place to evangelize and inspire from.
Yes, it is. And look at Dave. What is the modern day scourge in our society? At least at the point when he was dying. What is the most shameful thing? And be in that place of his degradation, yet to become a human agent for all of us. Okay? I mean, including me, because, being in that place of, I'm spiritual and I got it all together. It was his humility, his brokenness that started to open up very healing in my own life. Things of the world, Christ chooses to despise the strong.
Yes, let's keep that up after the break. Join me with Dr. Bob Schuchts from Theology of the Body Healing and Training Center. We'll be back after the break to talk more about God's loving mercy and healing of our wounds. Stay with me.